The handsome boy is walking ahead on the road, while a wounded father shouted for him to slow down. They were Rick and Carl, the father and son who had just escaped from prison. Carl impatiently listened to his father's nagging, feeling that Rick was mainly responsible for the destruction of the prison. Rick noticed the look in his son's eyes and stopped speaking. The father and son searched for supplies along the way and soon arrived at a house where they took temporary refuge. The rebellious Carl kept arguing with Rick, leaving him helpless. Rick went to the bathroom and endured the pain as he removed a bullet. The next day, Carl woke up from his sleep only to find his usually early-rising father still lying motionless. He felt a bit worried but pretended not to care. It wasn't until noon that Rick remained immobile. That's when Carl approached and shouted at him a couple of times, even giving him a kick. Now Carl started to feel anxious and placed a towel on his father's forehead. At that moment, he heard a noise from the door outside. When he looked through a side door, he discovered two zombies banging against it. Carl remembered his father's instructions to lure the zombies away to another location in such situations. Carl arrived at a forest, but unexpectedly, another zombie appeared behind Carl was quickly pushed down by 3 zombies and in the end, he managed to kill the zombies using his handgun. It took great effort for him to crawl out from under the zombies. Back in the room, Carl noticed that his father was still lying motionless. He spoke to himself about what had just happened, proudly mentioning that he had killed 3 zombies. He expressed his thoughts, rebelliously believing that Rick had failed to continue leading the group and instead focused on farming, which ultimately led to the downfall of the prison. He even thought that Rick could no longer protect him and his sister, and that he could survive on his own. One of the loneliest things for parents in the world is when they are no longer their child's hero. Carl sat on the ground and cried for a while before pouring out the supplies he had found on the floor. He decided to venture out again to find more resources, determined to prove that he could survive on his own. Soon, he approached a house and stood in front of the door, imitating the mannerisms of adults as he crashed into it. However, it didn't go as smoothly as he had imagined. Observing his father before, they seemed to handle such situations effortlessly. Eventually, Carl managed to pry open the door and entered. Fortunately, there was plenty of food inside, but as he climbed to the second floor, he encountered a zombie and nearly got bitten. In the end, he had to discard one of his shoes to escape. Carl sat on the rooftop, eating his food. With one shoe missing, he looked somewhat disheveled. Maybe the adult world isn't so easy after all. In the middle of the night, Carl was suddenly startled awake. He looked towards his father and noticed Rick's hand twitching. Frightened, he quickly moved back and even took out his own handgun. Rick rolled off the bed and reached out towards Carl. Overwhelmed with fear, Carl choked back tears. His father had turned into a zombie. The thought of having sent his mother away and now potentially his father was unbearable for Carl. He dropped his gun and said he really can't do it. Say he's wrong. He gave up the resistance. Living alone seemed meaningless. However, at that moment, Rick's hoarse voice called out Carl's name, urging him not to go outside and to stay safe. Then he collapsed again. Carl approached, holding his father's head, and softly said he was afraid that his father would really leave him. The next day, Rick regained his strength. This time, he didn't blame Carl. He praised him for finding so much food and acknowledged his efforts. Unbeknownst to them, Michonne had been following their trail since she left the prison. They had always missed each other by chance until Michonne spotted the can on the ground. She looked towards the nearby building and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the glass, she saw Rick and his son, alive and well. Michonne cries tears of joy. After 2 days of searching, she had finally found them. Upon hearing a knock on the door, Rick and Carl became alert. Rick glanced through the peephole and started laughing. The hardest part is Tyrese, who not only holds Judith, who is always ready to cry, but also has 2 girls, Lizzie and Mika. They were the same children entrusted to Carol back then. That night, they took rest in the woods. Lizzie has some special interests. When she saw 2 small rabbits in a tree hollow, she took out her little knife, and her expression gradually turned sinister. The next day, Tyrese continued to lead them in search of a safe place. Suddenly, they heard cries for help in the distance. Tyrese quickly handed the baby to Lizzie and told them to stay back to back while he went to investigate. He warned the children that if they encountered zombies, they should run in the direction he went. Only shooting is a last resort. When Tyrese arrived at the source of the cries, he found several strangers being attacked by zombies. Despite his efforts to help, these people couldn't escape their fate. Meanwhile, in the forest, the 2 sisters stood obediently in place. While Judith began to cry, Lizzie immediately covered her mouth, not just to silence her, but also with a strange sense of pleasure. Judith was finding it difficult to breathe, and Mika, facing away, remained unaware. At that moment, 2 zombies emerged from the forest, drawing closer with each step. Lizzie continued to coldly cover the child's mouth, enjoying herself. With no other option, Mika picked up the handgun. Hearing the gunshot, Tyrese sensed something was wrong. Seeing the zombies slowly approaching, Mika was directly scared and a little confused. Just as Tyrese dispatched one zombie, he heard Mika shouting his name. Tyrese turned around and saw the 2 sisters standing there unharmed. Behind them was Carol, which filled him with excitement. However, Carol seemed slightly panicked, thinking he might have found out that she killed his girlfriend, but instead, she was met with a hug from Tyrese. One of the group Tyrese helped is still alive, but has been bitten by a zombie. He informed that if they the railway tracks to the end, they would find a safe haven for survivors. They followed the railway tracks as instructed, not knowing how long they walked until they came across a map. It indicated a final destination, promising a secure place for survivors. Meanwhile, Daryl and Beth were also on the run, with Beth firmly believing that the others were still alive. She urged Daryl to stay positive and optimistic, knowing his tracking skills would lead them to the rest of the group. The next day, Daryl began tracking footprints in the woods. Although he believed it would be unlikely to find the others alive, he couldn't resist Beth's stubbornness. He didn't notice that there were 2 dissected bunnies in the trunk of the tree, clearly indicating the presence of someone who performed such acts in the prison. It was Lizzie, the one who fed rats to zombies. Eventually, the 2 of them reached the edge of the railway tracks. As soon as came out, saw the scene, there was even a small shoe on the ground, which made Beth burst into tears, thinking that the children had been killed. Daryl, being a straightforward person, didn't show any emotions, but after taking a few steps, he turned back. Maggie, Sasha, and Bob were also on the run together. Maggie's greatest concern was Glenn and Beth. After walking along the road for a long time, they finally spotted the bus. They run over, only to find that the people inside had turned into zombies. Maggie's heart sank, assuming that Glenn had met the same fate. However, she refused to give up hope and insisted on seeing it with her own eyes. Sasha had no choice but to help her by dealing with one zombie at a time. Maggie breathes a sigh of relief with every kill. Until the end, all the zombies were lying on the ground. Sasha and Bob also felt sorrow for these people. Maggie looked at the bodies, but Glenn was nowhere to be found. A glimmer of hope rose in her heart once again. Meanwhile, Glenn woke up inside the prison, surrounded by hordes of zombies. He looked around in confusion, wonder how Maggie is doing. He made his way to the cells. Grabbing his previous gear, Herschel's words echoed in his mind, urging him to hold on to hope. He firmly believed that Maggie was still alive and that he had to find her. Breaking through the zombie horde, he unexpectedly encountered a survivor. It was Tara. He stopped when he wanted to leave straight away. Glenn changed his mind. Tara was feeling despondent at that moment. It was all a scam by the governor. With Glenn's encouragement, she agreed to escape together. The 2 cooperated with each other and managed to escape from the prison. They made their way to the highway, where they encountered several approaching zombies. Glenn could have easily dealt with them, but weakened from his recent illness, he collapsed unconscious. Tara is also a bit anxious, facing an oncoming zombie herself. It was her first time killing one up close, and she vented her anger. However, their actions caught the attention of 3 individuals. In the previous episode, it was mentioned that Glenn was physically weak and had fallen into a coma. However, he encountered a trio of scientists who were escorting him. The man on the far left introduced himself as Eugene, claiming to have the ability to eradicate the zombie virus. They took Tara and Glenn with them as they continued their journey towards Washington. 3 hours later, Glenn regained consciousness and learned that they were now far away from their original location. He became immediately overwhelmed with emotions and smashed the glass, demanding the car to stop. He only wanted to go back and find his wife. The man beside him, Abraham, kept persuading him to stay and complete their mission together. This man was accompanied by the attractive Rosita, who was also part of the escort team for the scientist Eugene. Heading to Washington, Eugene possessed the knowledge to save humanity from the crisis, and Abraham hoped Glenn would set aside his personal feelings and work together for the future of mankind. However, Glenn didn't share the same sentiment. He solely wanted to find his wife. Abraham is still undeterred, repeatedly mentioning that Glenn's loved one was already dead. Upon hearing this, Glenn halted and put down his backpack. With a single punch, he struck Abraham, and the 2 engaged in a physical altercation. No one else could stop them. Meanwhile, Eugene, bored, watched the whole scene unfold. At this moment, some zombies emerged from the forest. Eugene, lacking any combat skills, could only retrieve a rifle from the car. The zombies approached closer, and upon hearing the gunshot, Abraham finally realized that Eugene had never used a gun before. The recoil was so strong that Eugene had no idea where the bullet went. Abraham rushed over to rescue Eugene, and the others also took out their weapons to kill the zombies. A few minutes later, all the zombies were dealt with, but unfortunately, the fuel tank was punctured by Eugene's actions. Glenn bid them farewell once again, as he had to return the same way to search for the bus. Tara, without hesitation, followed him, and it must be said that Glenn had quite the charm. Even Rosita followed suit. Rosita didn't possess the patriotism and ideals of Abraham. She just about surviving in a group. Eugene watched them as they went further away, suggesting they stick together until they found a vehicle before parting ways. And so, a new team was formed once again. As for Rick's side, their family of 3 lived harmoniously inside the house. Especially the bond between Carl and Michonne was very strong. At noon, Michonne and Carl prepared to venture out for supplies, while Rick stayed to rest. Rick's body hadn't fully recovered. Afterward, he took a shower, changed into a t-shirt and prepared to have a good nap in bed. While Rick was asleep, he heard a commotion, accompanied by the voices of many men. Rick immediately realized that someone had entered the room and they were coming upstairs. He quickly rolled over and hid under the bed, knowing that a dreadful fate awaited him if he were discovered. He also noticed his belongings outside, and he couldn't afford to lose everything over a bottle of water. Soon, the intruder arrived in the room and Rick held his breath. He had given his handgun to Carl, no means to defend himself. The person roamed around the house for a while, then stopped by the bedside. Rick's hands trembled with nervousness, fearing that the man would glance down at him any second. Fortunately, the man was lying in bed, and from their conversation, Rick learned that they would be staying overnight. A few minutes later, another man entered the room to a dispute with the previous man. They fought each other, both vying for the same bed, even beat each other up. The newcomer was eventually knocked to the ground and Rick could now see his face, which made him even more anxious. He prayed that the man wouldn't look his way, but immediately afterwards the man was turned around by a punch, turned his head towards Rick, startling Rick as their eyes met. He was just about to speak when the man strangled him around the neck, and the man strangled him straight into unconsciousness in defense of his sovereignty. The man then lay back on the bed to rest. 10 minutes later, when there was no movement from the bed, Rick surmised that the man had fallen asleep. He slowly crawled out from under the bed. "Don't dare make a sound." Rick stood up and observed the man, but at that moment, he heard shouts coming from downstairs. He quickly darted towards the staircase and hid in the bathroom before anyone entered. However, when he turned around, he found another person in the restroom. Both were taken aback. Rick took the initiative and swiftly strangled the intruder to death, then picked up his submachine gun for self-defense. He quietly slipped out through the window, scaling down from the second floor to the first. Slowly, he made his way to the front door, and just as he reached it, he heard a sound above his head. A man was right above him, but he failed to notice Rick. The man sat leisurely on the railing, showing no intention of leaving anytime soon. To make matters worse, Carl and Michonne happened to return at that moment. Rick had no choice but to take action and kill the man first. However, screams and gunshots erupted from inside the house, indicating that the man he killed had turned into a zombie. Rick didn't hesitate for a moment, shouting at the two to quickly leave. They didn't know where to go, so they decided to follow the railway tracks. During their journey, they came across a message: the Terminus welcomes all survivors and provides maps. They started towards the finish line. Meanwhile, Daryl and Beth embarked on a journey that resembled an apocalyptic road trip. One was pure-hearted and kind, while the other was a tough, cool guy. It didn't take long for sparks of love to ignite between them. They burned down a house, making gestures of love towards the sky. This is their romance. Unfortunately, one night, while staying in a house, they were unexpectedly swarmed by zombies. Daryl protected Beth inside the house, allowing her to escape. But when Daryl finally made it out, he didn't see Beth anywhere, only her abandoned backpack. A car drove away, leading Daryl to realize that Beth had been taken by a group of people. Daryl ran along the road, running all night. Now he was faced with a three-way intersection, completely unsure which direction to go. Daryl, exhausted and unable to run any further, can only sit on the floor. The love he had just found slipped away from him. Daryl dejected. Just then, a group of people arrived in front of Daryl. The man leading them was about to approach him. Daryl didn't care how many people there were. He threw a punch directly at the man. The old man's name was Joe, and he was the leader of a group called the Claimers. Despite being punched by Daryl, Joe surprisingly admired his strength and spirit. From then on, Daryl, with nowhere else to go, joined their group. Meanwhile, Maggie and the others discovered a sign by the railway tracks, advertising the Terminus. Maggie firmly believed that Glenn would go to the Terminus to find her. Sasha and Bob decided to accompany her. They continued their journey towards the Terminus. Little did they know, Glenn and his group were not far behind them. At that moment, Tara noticed a message up ahead. As she approached and read it, Glenn froze in disbelief. The message read, "Glenn, go to the Terminus." Maggie, Sasha, Bob. Glenn's tears welled up in his eyes. He firmly believed that his wife was still alive. The moment he saw the message, he was finally relieved. His wife was ahead of him, and he ran forward as if he had gone mad. After running for a long time, he finally stopped. Along the way, there were more messages left by Maggie. It seemed impossible to catch up with the others for the time being, as the tunnel ahead appeared to be blocked. Inside was pitch black, and they had no idea what dangers lurked within. Abraham made the decision to part ways at this point. He preferred to take a detour rather than go through the tunnel, as it seemed particularly treacherous. After the separation, Glenn and Tara entered the tunnel. They encountered a collapse inside, with numerous zombies buried beneath the rubble. However, Glenn wasn't about to back down, but he was determined to destroy them. When Glenn climbed onto a mound of dirt and looked ahead, he saw countless more zombies blocking their path. It was unrealistic to think they could get through. Despite the grim situation, Glenn didn't retreat. He repeatedly scanned the zombie horde for any sign of Maggie, hoping she had made it through. He persisted in clearing out the zombies. Meanwhile, Abraham also found a car he could drive. However, Glenn encountered trouble on his end. They attracted the attention of zombies on the other side, and planned to quietly slip away from this side. Unfortunately, as Tara descended from the mound, she slipped and got her leg stuck between some rocks. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't free her. Fortunately, the zombies hadn't noticed them yet. Tara urged Glenn to leave her behind and continue on, as both of them would likely die if they stayed. Glenn, however, was unwilling to abandon Tara. He turned around and began killing the zombies, but there were just too many of them. Use a dagger when the bullet is empty. When Glenn turned back, he was surprised to see Maggie and Abraham. It turned out that after finding a vehicle, they had encountered Maggie on the road, and they had come to their rescue in time. The couple was reunited. Glenn then introduced Tara to Maggie, leaving Tara feeling somewhat awkward. She had been attracted to Glenn's charismatic personality, and now meeting his wife felt uncomfortable. Soon, everyone gathered together, and Abraham naturally invited them to join in escorting Eugene. However, others suggested going to the Terminus first. They speculated that the people from the prison might have gone there, and then proceed to Washington. The next day, Daryl walked alongside the group called the Claimers by the railway tracks. Naturally, they noticed the advertisements for the Terminus. Daryl expressed his curiosity about the place, but Joe claimed it was likely a deception. Where is there any sanctuary now? And even if there were, they wouldn't welcome people like them. Daryl asked where they should go instead, and Joe explained that they had been in a house where a man had been hiding. Men killed their brothers and turned into a zombie, and everyone else was bitten to death. Now they were all searching for him. Fortunately, someone had seen what he looked like. Meanwhile, Glenn and the others finally arrived at the Terminus. The words Terminus caught everyone's attention. The place was unguarded and the place seemed peaceful. Everywhere they looked, it looked like it was before the end times. On the door, a sign read, "You're safe here." The group walked into the courtyard, where they finally saw a woman bustling about. They cautiously approached her,